Welcome to today's episode of Computer Vision for Businesses. Today we have a very special guest. Today we have Heather Couture. She is not only a computer vision consultant, but she's also the founder of Pixel Scientia Labs, where she partners with founders and R&D teams to support applications for people and planetary health. She has over 20 years experience in computer vision and machine learning, half of those working with applications for pathology, and she also has a PhD in computer science. Um, she has published in top tier computer vision and medical imaging venues. She has over 15 peer reviewed publications, and she's also the host for the Impact AI podcast, writes regularly on LinkedIn, and she has a newsletter called Computer Vision Insights. Her mission is to fight cancer and climate change with AI, and she does that by strengthening the machine learning components of her um, of her clients' more impactful projects. First of all, how are you, Heather?
I'm great, and it's great to be here at you, and thank
Thanks
you
a
for
lot for
inviting me.
being here. So let's start from the very beginning. So I did a very brief introduction about yourself, but I really want to hear it from you. We'd love to know more about you, your journey into computer vision and AI consulting. Could you walk us through your path from your first interesting computer vision problem to becoming a trusted advisor in this space? What are the most common challenges that you see that your clients normally face when they approach you?
Well, my first computer vision project goes back a number of years now. This was during an internship when I was an undergrad. I did a co-op program, so that meant we alternated between school and work every 4 months. And one of my work terms was for a machine vision company in the Washington, D.C. area. So we worked on a lot of applications for manufacturing. There was one with matching signatures for permanent residence cards. So we had to read the signature on the card and make sure it matched the one in the database. So it was, in hindsight, relatively simple applications, but very important ones for automating things at the time. But that taught me about some of the capabilities of automated image analysis. It wasn't even machine learning at the time. We weren't, there was no training and inference aspects. It was just, you know,
Yeah,
writing
more
out the steps
algorithmic kind
to
of
analyze an
approach, isn't
image and
it?
make a decision from it. Right, yeah. But that led me to seek out related courses when I got back on campus. And this is the early to mid 2000s. So the options were quite different than what's available today in coursework for undergrad. Yeah, there's a pattern recognition course, there's a graduate course on computer vision. So I took those even though I was still an undergrad. And that inspired me to apply for a master's program in computer vision. I went to Carnegie Mellon and worked on applications for autonomous science. So things that a future Mars rover might be able to use, detecting rocks, classifying them geologically. So very cool applications like that. I've worked for a startup after that, applying computer vision to movies and TV shows. So somewhat less exciting, but it was still a very worthwhile job that taught me quite a bit about the different ways you could
Really? What did
apply
they use
computer
it
vision
for?
and
Like,
machine
I
learning
didn't
coming into it
expect
at that point.
that sort of industry to be interested in computer vision.
Yeah, so at that time, it was things like taking a movie or TV show and splitting it into different shots and scenes, or identifying the faces and tracking the faces, and maybe even putting a name on the face. So you'd have a user manually say this group of faces is this person, but the software would do the grouping. We had stuff that could tell you whether the scene was at the beach, in the mountains, in a house, different things like that, to apply metadata for it to it and be able to search. And some of the early recommendations technology is what some of this was being used for at the time.
That makes sense. I think, like in general, these
Yeah,
kind of applications they have quite a lot of like different types of applications in general. Because what you just described here, it seems like it's already a very good toolbox to get early on in your career. It's about like a face detection and,
right.
and and all these kind of things that can be applied pretty much everywhere. So I'm curious, where did your
Right.
career led you after this job?
Well, during that job, towards the end of it, I started to desire a deeper exposure to research. Like I'd done a master's, I could read a research paper, I could implement it, but I wanted to know more, and so that led me back to school to do a PhD. I was already in the Research Triangle area in North Carolina, so I went to the University of North Carolina. They have a very good medical imaging program. So they work a lot with radiology, but I landed in the pathology space instead. So these are the images that pathologists would look at to diagnose cancer, for example. And my PhD was focused on studying breast cancer and trying to predict different properties of it that could help a doctor
All
figure out
right.
how to treat it. So that's I landed in the medical space there. I did some contract work on the sides during part of my degree, but when I graduated, having worked, having been to school a couple different times, at that point, having two young kids, I needed the flexibility. So I started consulting full time, and that was about 6 years ago now. I've been consulting since then. I've been doing computer vision overall for more than 20 years, so long before the current AI craze. And that's kind of
I'm
led
very
me here.
interested. I'm very
You also
interested
asked about.
about the part of your PhD in medical imaging, because it's one of the it was a heavy focus in my master degree. So I think, like, like when we used to approach it, I think it was before the big deep learning boom, uh, for my case, but it was mainly focused for segmentation of cancer and stuff like that. Was it more or less on the same terms for you, or like what was interesting when you were like doing your PhD?
So I started in 2012. Deep learning, the ImageNet paper that really popularized it for computer vision was published in 2012. But the tools for it to make it available to the broader spectrum of people who weren't coding all the nitty gritty to make it work with derivatives, that wasn't available for a couple of years later. So it was about halfway through my degree that deep learning really became accessible. Prior to that, we were using some of the more traditional approaches. We were doing feature learning, but not deep learning. So, more dictionary learning, if anybody's familiar with that. And we had some success with it, but once deep learning came on the scene, that dramatically changed what we
That
were
must has
capable
been
of doing.
a bit
We were
frightening for
able to.
you, especially like having that revolution in the middle of your uh, PhD time, because like there could be like someone, I don't know, like maybe using that new technology to overtake you or to publish before you. Like, was that a fear that you had at the time, or you didn't care too much?
I was not no, I was not concerned about that. I was definitely excited by the technology. And like I said, the other approaches we tried didn't have that much success. We tried some stuff on skin cancer, and we could not predict the thing that we were trying to predict. But as soon as we applied deep learning, we could. And yes, there's a ton of people now using deep learning. Even at that time, it was accelerating. But that doesn't mean they were
Mm.
studying breast cancer like I was, or at least not from with that type of imagery. We were trying to predict molecular biomarkers, and today there's a whole lot of research on that. At that time, nobody had yet shown you could do that from these images because the pathologist relies on molecular analysis to know things like the mutation status. So we were one of the first to show that that was possible with
All
breast
right, so that
cancer.
then you were ones that they could start to benefit early on from this new deep learning boom. Uh, start to ride the I wave early on. That's a good sign to be able to shift to wherever gives you the biggest benefit, because at the end of the day, this is like set of tools, and the work of a consultant is basically to be able to understand what are the tools available and select the best one. Do you agree with that statement?
Right. Yep. So, sounds reasonable to me. It's the As a consultant, I don't always know the right tool, but I often know don't bother with these ones, or let's dig into the research, understand the challenges better, and come up with a few possible tools or approaches or algorithms. I can recommend those, but your data set is different than anybody else. Certainly if you're a company building some novel application, your data set definitely is different. So we're going to have to experiment. I can reduce the experimentation you're going to have to do by understanding what's out there, but I can't completely
No, I
eliminate
completely
it.
agree. Like normally, one of the things I like to say is that when I provide the most value to my customers is when I tell them to not use the latest and greatest AI that they can find on, because like sometimes to dumb it down a little bit, focus on something smaller, something more specific, it's when
Yeah.
you tend to get the best results. And if not that, at least is when you get the most information about the problem and what you are trying to do.
Right. Start simple and iterate. If you end up needing to go more complicated to something state of the art, so be it. But you'll learn a whole
Exactly.
lot before that.
So you briefly touched about the in the consulting part, like what do you think is the most interesting bits or parts that you think made you want to stick to consulting for such a long time?
I think there's a few different aspects that are important to me. One is just being involved in more than one project at a time. I like the variety. I like to be able to learn something on one project and apply some derivative of that on another project. That doesn't certainly doesn't mean copying IP, but it means learning lessons, learning about what works, what doesn't, that type of thing from a higher level. So I like the diversity. As a mom with kids, I like the flexibility of it. I get to make my own hours. I get to choose my own projects. I get to decide when my summer vacation is. All those are a necessity for me at this point in my life. So it's kind of the combination of those that motivate me to make this work, no matter what.
No, definitely. I think being able to work in multiple projects at once, or at least have exposure to multiple projects in a relatively short amount of time, was one of the biggest selling points for me as well, because I always feel like you never learn as much as at the very beginning phase of a project. And doing that over and over again, I feel like is
Right.
the easiest way to improve as as an engineer, as a consultant, as a data scientist, however you want to put it. But I also find that it's when there is the most fun, because you effectively can do anything and everything. So are exciting times. So in general, I think it made sense for that end. And who doesn't like a little bit more
Yeah.
freedom with your own scheduling?
Right. And I think one other thing that brings to mind is that working on multiple projects and working at them on a higher level enables me to recognize patterns across different projects. So, yes, deep learning AI, it's all about pattern recognition. The computer's doing that, but I am also doing my own pattern recognition, seeing that teams tend to struggle with this. Or when I see this symptom in the experiments, that tends to mean I should look here and not there. Different
So
things
can
like
you
that.
share a couple of those patterns that you think that they are interesting? Like I'm sure we all really would like to hear what sort of patterns are you finding with your clients.
Um, I guess one that comes to mind is, you know, the model's not working as well as it should. We keep trying, we keep turning. Newer engineers tend to like to tune hyperparameters. That tends to be the first thing they try, or they go for a more advanced state of the art algorithm. That tends to be the thing they try, probably because that's what they were taught in school. But on real world data, that's not always the best approach. You need to understand what's going on, you need to understand your data, and often iterating on the data, whether that's something went wrong with the annotation, the different annotators and they weren't consistent in their definitions, or there's artifacts or some quality control thing that needs to be picked up. Iterating on that is often more effective, but iterating based on data, so based on observations you make about your results, is typically what the path I guide them on, instead of just tweak this hyperparameter, tweak that hyperparameter, grab the latest state of the art model. Those are typically less effective. That one comes
Yeah,
up
I
quite a
couldn't
bit.
agree more with that. Like, definitely, I would say, I mean, in general, I think it has been proven with quite a lot of different papers that the model itself, it doesn't matter that much. If you can improve the amount and the quality of your data, that's going to be like a lot more impactful that any other crazy model. I mean, unless there is like a very big shift, like deep learning itself. I would say that for changing a model from the structure for something like that, and I think that's quite obvious when we are looking at what's popular right now, like with LLMs and stuff like that. We have the transformer-based architecture, which yes, it's great, but it requires a lot more data to be able to extract these patterns. So first get enough data, and then you can start to play with something a bit more advanced. But until you have validated your data set, there
Yes.
is no too much point to move forward. But yeah, like any other pattern or insight that you would like to share with us?
Um, on the projects that I work on, it's often about, at the outset, can we actually do what we want to do with this data? Because I work on a lot of research applications, it's not somebody else has done this, let's copy it. It might be somebody else has done this on a totally different modality of data. I wonder if we can do it on ours. Maybe it's a new medical imaging modality, something like that. So there's a lot of questioning it in the beginning. Um, you know, some some people will come into it assuming that if you've got data, you can do it, but you need to ideally back that up with a bit of research. So exploring what others have done that are somewhat similar to your application, but then you also need to experiment on your data, and that's not as easy as it sounds. So there's a lot of iteration and a lot of experimentation, and to some that can be surprising going into it.
So the way that I normally like to explain like similar concepts like that, it's between like, uh, are we doing interpolation or extrapolation? I mean, if we have two different projects and we are trying to do something in the middle, meaning that both of them have proven to work, and we do something more or less in between, it's quite likely that it's going to work. But if we do extrapolation and we have two different projects and we're trying to do something completely outside of this realm, then it's not as certain that we're going to get good results. Would you think that is a decent explanation for what you were saying?
That sounds reasonable, yeah.
Perfect. All right. So I'm very curious about in your career, you have working projects for climate change, cancer detection in the PhD. You already mentioned that. So over 20-year career, there's quite a lot of project and interesting insights to extract from there. So could you share a couple real world examples of how computer vision and AI have made an important impact on those areas? Because like clearly the areas that you are focusing on are really important but also hard to tackle. So I'm very curious to hear what sort of project and what impact did they have. What do you think are the most interesting ones?
Well, the first one is from my PhD research, the one we started talking about already, from breast cancer, trying to predict biomarkers. So these are things that could help a doctor determine how to treat a patient, whether treatment is likely to be successful, what their survival chances is likely
And
to
this
be,
is with
that kind of thing.
MRI pictures of
Um,
the skin, everything, or
This is with, so they're called histopathology images. So if you, a doctor suspected you might have cancer, they would take a biopsy. So a sample of tissue from whatever organ, from whatever lesion they're suspicious of. They send it to the lab. It's processed, it's sliced, it's stained, and a pathologist looks at it under the microscope. And these stains highlight different structures of interest. So the gold standard for diagnosis is two stains called H&E, which turn nuclei blue and cytoplasm pink. So this is this bright pink and blue and purple image. It's often 100,000 pixels by 100,000 pixels if it's resected tissue instead of just a biopsy. So these are massive images. There's a smaller version of that we were working on for my PhD research, but we were trying to predict things that pathologists relies on molecular analysis for instead. We were one of the first ones to show that that was possible with breast cancer, and this was. So I finished my PhD in 2018, so the research on that was published that year. Since then, there's a whole bunch of startups who have popped up using their own variant of that algorithm, newer technology, transformers instead of, the ImageNet based models that we were using at the time. They've all shown this is now possible for many other types of cancer, many other biomarkers. Pharma's using it for clinical trials, for companion diagnostics to decide whether you're a good candidate for a drug. So I got to be involved in some of the early phases of research for this, and it's quite exciting to see how it has exploded since. So that's kind of the top example that I like
Yeah,
to talk
definitely.
about.
Like that must have been a really exciting first, well, not first, but I mean like topic to have on your PhD because combining this explosion of deep learning with AlexNet and the ImageNet data set and so on, that must have been the first meaningful way to tackle these kind of projects. I mean, when you are dealing with such a massive image, and I'm curious, like that must have been super challenging to deal with super big images like that. You said 100,000 pixels by 100,000 pixels. Is this correct?
For Yeah, for resected tissue, they can be that large. During my PhD, we were using what's called a tissue microarray. So they take the samples from all the patients. They actually then use a needle to extract a smaller core sample. They put all those cores on a slide and they image those. So instead of the full slide for each patient, you're looking at probably four different cores that are 2500 by 2500 pixels. So still larger than your average image that goes into a deep learning model, but scaled down. So that's if you're only going to look at part of the tissue that's been hand selected. A lot of the applications today do use those whole slide images that I mentioned that can be 100,000 pixels across. No
No.
GPU can process that end to end, although there are strategies to try. So we typically tile them. We discard the tiles that don't have any tissue because some of these are just white backgrounds. But we chop them up into whatever size is appropriate for the network that we're putting that into. So that might be 256 by 256, for example, and deal with those tiles. And then models that are trying to make a patient level prediction then have to learn to aggregate any tile features that you
Interesting.
extract.
Yeah, just to give a bit of context, if it's like 100,000 pixels, like that would be in height 100 images stacked and in width around 50 images stacked. So it's like 500 times bigger than normal image, calling it a 1080p image, a normal stuff that you normally process in many applications like this. So if it's a lot more challenging to process like I don't know a 4K stream compared to a 1081, having to process 500 of those, that is just to give a bit of context to the readers about what sort of numbers we are talking about here, like 500 times larger than a 1080p frame. Yeah, it's something clearly really challenging, and that needs to be reduced down before actually being processed. Super interesting. Any other projects that you would like to share with us?
Well, the other one is on the climate side because I do a lot of work there as well. So this is using for tackling climate change using satellite images. And this is a client project. We were estimating greenhouse gas emissions from power plants globally. So we train on plants in countries that do publish their generation or emissions data, and then take those models and apply them to other plants around the world. So there's a lot of complex data engineering that goes into this project. Data engineering that's well beyond me. That's definitely not my specialty. They have to get the ground truth labels for us. They need to have the plant geolocated. They have to know different characteristics of the plant that we might look for. But in doing that, we were able to train models to give an estimate of what that plant is doing in a particular satellite image on a particular day. And from that, aggregate up to we think this plant is producing this amount of CO2 over the month or over the year. And
Ah,
this region, so a state or a province or a country, is doing this. And we started tackling power plants, and this was a little over 5 years ago that I started on this project. It rapidly evolved into a much larger collaboration called Climate Trace that with other organizations who are tackling other sectors of the economy. So oil and gas, heavy industry, transportation, agriculture, shipping, a whole bunch of other industries I can think of right now. And they're publishing estimates on the Climate Trace website for these other sectors, publicly available for
really?
anybody to
That's
use.
great.
And so another example of a small project that snowballed into something larger. So those are kind of my two favorite applications: cancer and climate
So
change.
in this second one is about getting satellite images and then trying to predict how much power a power plant is creating. That was the initial goal, or what was it?
So
Ah,
it's
emissions.
emissions,
Okay, okay,
so
okay.
greenhouse gas emissions, which for power plants is largely carbon dioxide. There's other gases they produce as well, but carbon dioxide is the main one. But if we can estimate
Mm,
how much the plant is generating at a particular time, we can apply emissions factor. So
yeah.
multiply that number by something, and we estimate that the plant
Ah,
is
now
producing this
now I
much
see what you're saying.
CO2.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, like satellite images are incredible. Like you can see quite a lot of. I mean, the lenses that they use and everything. You can get quite a lot of detail. So I'm happy to see that they are being used for something as interesting as this.
Yeah. And in this case, we're looking for visible signals, which the easiest one is a vapor plume. So every plant needs to cool and needs to have a cooling technology while it's producing the electricity. So depending on the cooling technology, they might have. If you think of even a nuclear power plant
Yeah.
has this giant concrete tower. That cooling tower produces steam. So it's that vapor plume that we're seeing in
Mm.
the satellite image. And that's the easiest signal to pick up. There are others that we're looking for and others we're experimenting with, but that's the most obvious one.
All right. So how did you guys approach that problem? Like you were processing the entire massive image, or like where the actual power plants were located, and you were monitoring that particular spot. Ah, okay.
So we know where they're located. There are different databases that keep track of where power plants are, what their name is, what kind of fuel they're burning, what their capacity is, what their cooling technology is, what their emissions reductions technology, different things like that. So we know where they are. We know a lot about them. We can grab images of that general region of maybe a few kilometers across. So we started out with those kind of larger region of interest images and trying to predict this, and initially just predicting on or off. We didn't even, in the beginning, we didn't even try to predict this plant is at high capacity, is at low. We just wanted to know, is it on or is it
A
off? Because
lot.
that tells us whether this is doable. Is it a signal we can predict? And we're successful with that. But to get even better results, we instead of that wide ROI, we had annotators go in through OpenStreetMap and say the cooling tower is here, the flue stack is here, and we know exactly where they are, so we can grab a much narrower patch around the thing that we were trying to analyze. And that produced even better results because the models didn't need to decipher from the whole image, is this white thing a plume or is it a building?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
models
yeah.
knew where to
No,
look.
definitely much smarter to do it this way. Otherwise, pretty much like 99.9% of all the images wouldn't be relevant to the system. So I'm really curious about you're talking that you tackle very complex problems that you are not even sure at the very beginning if they are possible or not. So I would like to know a little bit of what's your framework for determining if a particular computer vision application it's possible. I mean, I know that there's always a bit of experimentation, but in general, what would you say that they are the most common steps that you normally take towards being able to assess the viability of a particular project?
Well, for it to be accessible to computer vision, first of all, you need images or some other spatial type of information. It could be video, it could be 3D data, it could be point clouds. There needs to be spatial information. It could be spatial plus something else, but that spatial information is key. So you need to have those images available. The number of them that you need is very much going to depend on the project, but larger quantity is certainly better. Typically, you're trying to predict something from these, so detect an object, predict whether a mutation is present or not, predict how much this power plant is producing, different labels like that. So you need to have those labels available or at least attainable. So can a human annotator go in and annotate those for you? Or do you need ground truth data from these power plants, their self-reported data saying what they're doing at this particular time? Those labels need to be attainable for you to be able to learn anything. So you need to consider the size of the image data set, how many labels you might be able to collect. You need to consider the quality of these images, if they're completely noisy, filled with artifacts, if the labels you have are all over the place, done by different annotators and don't make any sense. You've got a quality problem that's might pop up later, so that's something to catch in the beginning. And I guess another thing is, can humans see the signal that you're looking at? It's not a deal breaker, certainly, because in the breast cancer example, these are things that pathologists cannot see from that image. But it's going to be easier if a human can see the signal that you're trying to predict. If they can't, it's probably harder, but those are kind of my favorite applications to tackle anyway. It just means there's going to be a heavier research component. So those kind of revolve around the data. Beyond that, you need a clear problem definition. So, what is the task that you're trying to accomplish? Are you trying to automate something? What business problem does it solve? If it's just for fun, it's probably not going to make you any money. And so, if you're a commercial entity, that might not be the smartest path, but needs to solve a business problem if this is a business application. You'll need infrastructure for the data and for the compute. You need to be able to build that. You need to have the resources in order to build that. And one piece that's sometimes missing is domain expertise. So you might already have those domain experts who know what those images are, know what's in them, know what the complications will be. But if you don't, it's going to be more challenging. You need somebody who understands what's going on in order to help guide what should be looked for, what complications are likely to come up. That domain expertise is
Definitely,
essential.
I think it ties really well with the patterns that you were mentioning before. Like clearly, if you don't have a good amount of data with high quality labels and pretty much the infrastructure to bring the project to life, then that's pretty much impossible. And because, yeah, like machine learning doesn't do magic unless it has a lot of data. That's the way I like I like
Right.
to put these kind of projects. One thing that I would like to ask you about the framework and so on, like regarding, let's imagine that there is kind of one of those projects that you are not very sure of if it's possible or not. What sort of techniques do you think are the most interesting ones for you to try earlier on? Like I'm talking about classification versus object detection versus segmentation. Among those three, like is there anyone that you normally prefer when you're just trying stuff around?
I think it's going to really depend on the application and what a meaningful result is. Of those, classification is usually the easiest. So, in the example with the power plants, instead of trying to predict what they're doing at a particular time, just predicting whether on or off is a whole lot easier. It's also a whole lot easier to then go through the data and say, the model says it's on when it's off. What's going on there? Rather than the model says it's operating at 50% and the self-reported data says it's operating at 70%. That's a whole lot more difficult to decipher. So classification is easier than regression. Segmentation and object detection, it just depends on the application. Like you might, if you're trying to find cars, for example, if you cars are relatively big, then just trying to do a classification. Is there a car in this image or is there not? That's going to be easier to set up than an object detector. But it also depends on what your annotated data is. If you have humans that are going to just quickly say this image has a car and this one doesn't, that's pretty quick to set up a test and do the annotation for. Whereas if the cars are smaller or there's multiple cars, the annotation effort is that much greater. So part of it's what's easy for the model to do, part of it's what's easier for the annotators to do, and part of it's what's actually a meaningful result. So it might be that we know this image has a car in it. We want to know the boundaries of that car, and a yes or no is not a meaningful result. We need the pixel level segmentation, but maybe a bounding box would be easier than segmentation, and so that's an easier starting point. So just kind of thinking through the different steps with gathering the data, with annotating the data, and with modeling to figure out what the simplest baseline is.
No, I agree. Like in general, I think it depends a lot. I mean, I feel like, for example, between object detection and segmentation, clearly object detection is always like a tad bit easier, meaning you could convert from one to another. What I mean is like if you have a segmentation mask or like some um, the outline of a person, you can convert it into a bounding box. So like you effectively simplifying the problem to say it like that. But no, in general, I think like that's completely right. It really depends on what's the objective of the project. So now that we talk about your framework, I really would like to look it from the other side. So we know what you need, but what do you think are some signs for a company that it would tell them that they are ready for a computer vision project? Like, what do you think is the tipping point for going from manual to automated? Like, is there any particular patterns that you might have seen that maybe give a good hint to the decision makers in the company that now it's a good time to start a computer vision project?
So you probably get a slightly different answer from me on this than you would from other consultants, and that's because I'm typically involved with projects that are or will be a key component of their business. It might be part of their main product that they're developing. So in that case, they've before they talk to me, they already know what they want to develop. It's not a question of should they apply computer vision. It's
Mm,
generally how
I
instead of
see.
if. But your question of automated to manual. I do work with some clients who are developing tools for pathology to streamline a pathologist workflow, for example. So they're trying to tackle repetitive manual tasks, create an automated system to do that instead. Or it could be because there's a high error rate in manual inspection, or there's a safety risk with the human doing the inspection, or they're trying to scale up and want to tackle that annotation on a much larger scale, and humans cannot do that. So, for example, power plants, we could have people go look at these images and say this one's on, this one's off. We think this one's operating at high capacity, this one's at low, but we couldn't get the number of humans together possible to do that for all the satellite images around the world. So that project needed to scale up. It needed to scale to be possible even from the beginning. Often, often the system is in some of the projects I work on is also not to replace a manual process. Sometimes it's to create something new. And this power plant example, there isn't a pre-existing system that looks at satellite images manually. The only way to do that was to make it automated. Some of the medical applications I work on, it might be to generate new insights, to provide new information to the clinician that wasn't available before, at least not through visual inspection. So it's often not a case of manual to automation. It's that other that the automated way with using other data as labels is the only way to go. But like I said, this is for projects that are fairly researchy, and these are often the core product when it's a startup developing them.
No, I see your point of view, and clearly, if the client already has a very clear idea in their mind, then yeah, it's more about saying like it's possible or it's not possible. Uh, in general, I would say like yeah, the scale is one of the biggest factors because like if you need to employ 100 people to just monitor a few things, like it doesn't make sense at that scale, and it could be even much more people than that. And then it's also about like the real time component, like do you need it running 24/7, do you need it really fast detections in a particular format that they need to be processed somehow. Like these are the kind of advantage that you get with automation in general. But I'm just curious, like normally, like when I deal with clients, they have an idea, but they do not really know exactly uh, what it is that they want to do. Like in your case, like I'm sure that they really want to hear your input regarding what's possible, or am I wrong there?
It really depends on the client. So some of them do have a clear vision of what they want to do. They maybe have started doing it already. They're just not experienced enough to take it all the way. In other cases, it is a client that is very new to machine learning, to computer vision, and they think this will be cool. They think, if we could do this on this type of images, that would be helpful. Maybe the new medical imaging device is one example, is what comes to mind. So I've worked with a couple clients. They're developing new modality so that, whether it's a skin lesion or during surgery or something like that, the tissue can be inspected then and there and give a result to the clinician right away instead of sending a sample off to the labs. They're developing a new modality. And in that case, developing the medical imaging device was their first core product. And it's the extensions on that, potentially using AI, that the question comes in: can we do that? How can we do that? What's needed to do that? And all that. So in that scenario, very much does come up.
So I think like now this brings us to very nicely to our next question, which is about the timeline. And I know probably in your case they tend to be a bit longer than for more consultants, since you are involved in more kind of research and development projects, which they tend to require more time. But in general, and especially if you can give some interesting examples, like what do you think is a realistic expectation for getting from an idea to a working system in the context of a computer vision project?
So the thing to keep in mind is a lot more than computer vision goes into building a working system. Sometimes it's the optics just to acquire images. Sometimes that's already been collected. You might need to develop the standard process for collecting those images, for annotating that. There's infrastructure for data storage, compute resources, a data engineering pipeline, which can be simple or can be very complex. There's the computer vision modeling, that relatively small piece in the larger project. There's deploying it after, there's monitoring and retraining models. All these are critical for creating a working computer vision system. In medical applications, there might even be a regulatory approval process. And so that's going to extend the timeline out. So, on the types of things that I work on, I'd say absolute minimum a year, often a few years in terms of timeline. And typically, these are things that are my clients are continuing to iterate on. It's not a finished thing. It's, in my experience, not really ever a finished thing as long as it continues to be used. They're always iterating. But that's for developing a product that uses computer vision and is very different than, for example, putting a smart camera on a manufacturing line that could be done in a few
No,
weeks.
definitely. I mean, one of our clients we've been working on for over 2 years, and there is no sign to stop yet, because like when you get to a
Yeah.
complex problem, it's actually hard to draw a line when to say it's actually done, because you continually want to improve it and uh, want to get some interesting benefits. But I feel like in general, it's actually quite fast. And I think like what you said at the very beginning is what's really interesting, that the computer vision part sometimes it's a bit smaller, meaning that with relatively little time, sometimes the proof of concept can be built up from the ground and test that this is something that can be done. And when we have this information and we can see that this idea it can be a reality, then is when it makes sense to go and plan for the entire project. So in my mind, it's more like the proof of concept is relatively fast, but then to build up the entire infrastructure and to make sure that it makes sense, then obviously it depends. But I think it's
Right.
not as much as some people may think, but clearly much more than just a few weeks for building the entire thing.
Yeah, and very much will depend on the type of application and the rigor that's involved in
I
validating
mean,
it.
having to work with medical imaging and stuff like that, I cannot even begin to imagine the amount of regulation that there must be for this kind of data and security and so on. I mean, I've worked in the past in a few military companies, and they also have like very strict data regulations and policies. So I'm sure that they share like similar types of data policies.
Yeah, the data that I typically work with has been anonymized. So still, rules regarding its use, but less stringent than patient data where you can identify who that patient is. That's the part that I, as a consultant, generally don't have hands in. That's
Yeah.
HIPAA in the U.S. and other requirements. A whole lot more
Yeah,
stringent.
makes sense. So let's move on to the next question. So we will know how critical a well-structured project roadmap for computer vision initiatives actually is. Now that we talk about the entire timeline, like, could you share your approach for creating a roadmap? When I mean the roadmap, I'm talking about like defining what are the intermediate milestones and how do you want to structure the project. And I'm especially curious in your case that you tend to deal with more researchy projects, that this initial kind of time investment to what I normally call the proof of concept, making sure that the project is actually feasible, that must take a bit longer than normal. So I'm very curious to hear how you tackle the roadmap for the project. And yeah.
So a lot of pieces of this are things that came up in the previous questions in one way or another. But the first one is just defining the problem. What is it you're trying to solve? How will it integrate into the workflow of whoever's going to use the system? What pain points is it going to solve? Is it solving a business problem? Understanding the data, understanding variations, understanding computational limitations, anything that's going to help set the scope for the rest of it, and you know making sure that's an important thing to even tackle in the beginning. So that's kind of the most critical thing up front. And because a lot of projects I work on are very research oriented, the next step is research, digging into related research, literature search, being the most important part of that, to see what's been done in the academic literature on similar data, on similar tasks, not partly to see how they solved it, but also to see what challenges they came up with, because that might make you realize, oh, we're going to have to tackle this and we didn't even realize that. So just surveying what's out there, surveying other solutions for solving the problem, existing code bases or data sets or pre-trained models that might be helpful to kickstart your project, anything that can save time and resources down the line. So that research phase can be fairly extensive, but it can also tell you go or no go on even trying to prototype a solution. It might tell you we're not likely to succeed, at least where technology is right now. Let's work on something else. Or might tell you these are the challenges we're likely to tackle. Or when we're collecting your data, we need to be much more careful about this. So it can tell you a whole lot about how to approach the rest of the problem. So kind of the third phase, based on that information, is understanding the data, its challenges, how you're going to collect it if it's not collected already, how you're going to annotate it if it's not annotated already. And working with domain experts is absolutely critical there. They're the ones who know how that data is collected, what you're trying to image, what's in the images, what's important about what's in the images, what features they look at. You might not look at the same features, but knowing what they look for at least gives you a way to perhaps kickstart it or give you more insight into the problem. They might tell you different variations to expect in the real world, like this scanner gives different colors than that scanner, or this lab, the colors coming out of the staining tend to be different. Or if you go to a different country, the patients are quite different. The same applies to satellite imagery as well. The vegetation in this region, yeah, they're both this type of tree, but they look a lot different. In this region, they're a lot taller, and something related to that might tell you a whole lot more about the problem and its complexity. So you need to have a plan for your data, and then you need to have a plan for validating your model. So not just we annotated a bunch of data, we're going to split it into train, validation, and tests. Well, how are you going to split it? If you need to be sure that your model works on a different scanner or a different country, you need to be sure that you're testing that. So maybe the test set is holding out a country, or maybe you're going to get an external validation set that's collected separately, and that's how you're going to validate. Whatever whatever the challenges are, you need to have that checked with your validation plan to be sure that your model can tackle those challenges. After validation, that might just That might be where you're getting to a prototype phase, or it might be the first step of a longer project. So it's developing a simple baseline. The keyword being simple, the simplest solution you can come up with. It doesn't need to be complex. It doesn't need to work great. It's not going to be your final solution, but it's a place to start, and it can tell you a whole lot more about the complexity of the problem. It can tell you that the annotators were inconsistent, and so you're going to have to go back and iterate. So at this point, you don't have all your data annotated. You have a small set, and the baseline model can tell you to iterate. So whatever that plan for a baseline model is, just keep it simple. And still in the planning phase, you might have some ideas on where to go beyond the baseline model. They're not where you're going to start, but from your research, you've probably written out some ideas of where you might go or how you might achieve a better model, and they're in your notes. And after your baseline model, if you're continuing through this, that's where you're going to iterate. That's where you're going to look at your results, and that's where you're going to learn how to improve. And also, in planning it out, you need to have a plan for deploying, monitoring, and maintaining your model. You're not done once you have that final model. How's it going to work in the real world? How are you going to make sure that the data doesn't change? Or if it does, you're going to catch it and stop, or you're going to retrain. What needs to happen when this model is operating in the real world? If you're in the planning phases, not all of these steps need to be in great granular detail, but you need to have a general perspective on how you're going to tackle it, so you're not blindsided with a problem at the end. That you didn't realize your data is going to have this shift over time. COVID comes along, and a lot of medical applications are
Definitely.
thrown off because of it. We know now to expect the unexpected,
Yeah.
but you need to monitor for it.
No, I think you covered really all the most important steps, heavy emphasis on the research stage for, in your particular case, then making sure that I would say that there are some agreements, at least with the customer, about like what sort of data we're going to use, what sort of intrinsic and extrinsic parameters, like the intrinsic being the ones that we going to care as data scientists, and the intrinsic is the one that the client actually cares. Then it's about having a prototype, something really simple, but that can get the job done, at least teach us what we don't know yet, and make sure that we can get this very simple approach to a successful level. And if we can, then we can move to the next step, which is pretty much iterating and making sure that we get to the performance level desired by the client or the customer. And finally, it's about deploying and monitoring, which clearly a lot it's a lot more frequent than many people may actually think, that there is quite a lot of potential changes that can occur, especially when you have trained it with a fairly limited amount of images. If you have trained your model with images of your warehouse or something in those lines, and then you have added like a really bright light, um, it's easier to get reflections. It's easy to get like shadows where you didn't have them, and so on and so forth. And all those things, they can start to provide detections that you didn't have before. And it's not that the model is actually worse, it's that the conditions have changed. So what you are saying about being able to monitor that and understanding when there is something that has triggered a change that requires a retraining or some sort of modification, it's pretty much even could be even more important than training the model right in the first place, because if you don't monitor that, you're never going to know when there is a breaking change. Perfect. So we talked a little bit about the roadmap, meaning all the different stages that they are involved in the planning and when bringing the project to life. So I'm very curious to hear what sort of comments do you normally hear about AI in general, because I feel like at this point in time we are all a bit tired of hearing so much about like LLMs, how everything is going to change, and so on and so forth. Like, how do you think that this LLM world has affected our smaller world of computer vision? Is there any sort of I don't know, preconceptions or mindsets that you see in your clients that have changed because of this? Like, do you think that the entire ChatGPT, Claude, DeepSeek now, uh, how it has affected the vision of your clients respect computer vision?
Um, so in some ways, I don't think it's affected, for example, medical applications and the perspective of business leaders all that much. The challenges are still there. If you're dealing with text and LLMs and natural language, the solutions come a whole lot easier. And part of that's because of this foundation model concept that you can train one large model on broad data and adapt it to a new task. That's why these language applications work. And so this is getting more down the technical stream, but the same concept applies to computer vision. You can train a large, broad model and you can fine tune it for different downstream tasks. So I don't know that I suspect that not all business leaders are aware of this yet, but an increasing number are aware of the concept of a foundation model and the benefits that it brings. That you can, instead of training a separate supervised model for each task, you can take your larger foundation model and do a bit of fine tuning and get a new model up and running, whether it's prototype or your final model, much quicker with less labeled data. So the technology has transferred over to computer vision in ways that make some of these problems more accessible and easier to solve and quicker to solve. And it's not that you take that publicly available foundation model that's trained on an ImageNet like data set. It's the same concept has been applied to satellite images and to pathology images, and somebody else, a research group or startup or Microsoft or Google, somebody has trained those domain specific foundation models, and those are now available for some of these tasks. And so an increasing number of the business leaders that I come across are aware of that concept and are aware of how it can affect them. So I think it just depends on the level of technical savvy and as to whether that's part of it. But certainly an increasing number of them are aware of how the LLM phenomenon has transferred to computer vision and into
So,
specific
other
domains
than
within it.
their vision, do you think that it's I mean, like pretty much the LLMs have made possible uh, quite a quite a lot of previous tasks that they were uh, you know a bit hard in it of themselves, like I don't know, like sentiment analysis, summarization, all this kind of tasks. They now effectively ChatGPT, any massive LLM can do them for you. Do you think that introducing this paradigm shift in computer vision is going to make, I don't know, it's going to make computer vision more appealing to smaller companies because now they can solve their problems in a faster and cheaper way, or you don't think it's going to be the case?
I think it's true that foundation models will do enable a smaller company or anybody to get a new prototype up and running. I that doesn't that doesn't eliminate the experimentation and the data curation and all the complexity with data. So it speeds up the model prototyping phase. It reduces the amount of labeled data you need. So it reduces the annotation phase. You still need validation data. You still need some data to train your supervised model on, but it reduces what you need at least to get started. I don't know that everybody's aware of all that yet, but yes, it does make some things simpler. Not as simple as it is with LLMs, because there's still extra complexity with this data, and because unique modalities of imaging are different than natural imagery in the ImageNet and derivative data sets like that. That's quite different than a GPT model that's trained on all text from the internet, and you want to fine tune it on legal text or medical text that it was already trained on. You do some fine tuning. That's simpler than trying to take a larger general model and adapt it to satellite images, for example. That doesn't work nearly as well. But there's definitely opportunity. I'm trying to spread the message about foundation models. I did a webinar on it for pathology last week, so I'm very much vocal in that area, trying to spread the message on what it's capable of and what to watch out for, because it doesn't solve
Definitely. I
everything.
mean, clearly there are quite a few interesting models that they can be leveraged right now. I don't know, like Florence V2, I think is the first one that comes to my mind regarding having this kind of capabilities. But there's also like Owl V2, if I'm correct, that you effectively can pass it names of things that you want to detect on it, and even if it has not been specifically trained for that, it can detect those objects to a different degree of accuracy to something that has been specifically trained for that. But I think it's very
Yeah.
useful to do the prototyping. I think like what you are saying is completely right. It reduces the amount of work that you have during the prototyping stage. Even maybe can do the first pass of the annotation, meaning that you then can fine tune how the bounding boxes there are, or like the segmentation mask is looking. But it can be quite useful for having fast prototyping, but it's never going to replace having a dedicated model for something specific. Because I think like what it's quite obvious with the LLMs is that they require a lot of power, and when they can do everything, they cannot do everything efficiently. Like having a much smaller model for summarization is always going to be preferred, and that's why you cannot run those models on your phone or something with a lot less memory and processing power than a GPU. So there's always like this kind of trade-off. Do we want flexibility? Do we want efficiency? And that's more or less the way I see these things. So I think it's exciting for the field of computer vision, because clearly a lot of things that weren't possible before, especially at a lower budget or at a lower uh, time investment, now they are possible, which I think is exciting. Are there any foundational models, world models, whatever you want to call them, that that you think are especially interesting to you, or you don't think there are any for the areas that you're working with yet?
There, this is an exploding area in pathology, especially remote sensing. There's a lot more academic groups there, and NASA and so on. They're developing them. On the pathology side, the startups, often in collaboration with Microsoft or IBM or Oracle, whoever they're partnering with in order to get the compute. But the action for pathology is happening in industry, and some of these models are getting very large and very powerful, and they're throwing more data at it. The webinar I just did listed out, I think, about 20 of them for pathology at this point, and there's some that operate on the individual tiles that I mentioned. So if you split the gigapixel image into, um, you know, 256 by 256 image, or whatever size you want there, a lot of these models are trained on tiles. But there are other models that take a tile embedding from a foundation model and train a slide level foundation model to predict some kind of patient characteristic. So they're kind of two layers of transformers, and that's to me very exciting as well, because a lot of the labels we have for biomarkers, we can't say this tile is present or absent. It's this patient has this characteristic, or this patient responded to this treatment, for example. So some of those slide level foundation models are exciting, and for satellite imagery, there's a ton going on there. They're developing them in different ways. Instead of contrastive methods, they're using reconstruction methods. So things like a masked autoencoder, for anybody who's familiar with that. And they're dealing with the spectral dimension and the temporal dimension in addition to the spatial dimensions. So there's extra stuff that can go into some of these foundation models for satellite imagery, but there's a lot of potential there as
Interesting,
well.
interesting. I wasn't aware of those particular developments, but it clearly seems that it's moving on the right direction. We talked
Yep.
about how now like smaller companies can leverage computer vision because of these new advancements in foundational models. But one of the key terms that pretty much everyone in business tends to focus on is ROI, or return on investments. I would like to ask you, is there any particular case study or experience that you had that has delivered some unexpected value other than the ROI? Like, for example, like you were mentioning um, the project with detecting when the power plants were on and off, and how this has led to a bigger project afterward. Is there any other project that you think is another example of how um, starting a project can lead to more benefits than what it was initially designed for?
So for a lot of the projects I work on, the ROI is a number of years out. So many of the ones I've been consulting on, I don't have those examples yet. You mentioned the climate trace project with estimating emissions. That's definitely one example that fits this. We started just as a collaboration between two nonprofits with some funding from Google. 5 years later, there's a dozen member organizations, hundreds of contributors. Former Vice President Al Gore is one of the members in this project, and leading a lot of the funding initiatives and public speaking about it. We're covering all sectors of the economy, not just power plants. There are companies and governments using the data to make decisions about climate action. And all this from a little project that I joined as a consulting gig. So to me, that one definitely fits the bill of I did not know what the ROI would be when we started on this. I'm not sure that anybody quite did. And then the other example is, once again, the breast cancer research. For me, it was a research project for my PhD, and that's where my personal research on that topic ended. But since then, there are probably more than a dozen startups. This is about 10 years later now, that are developing similar biomarkers for other diseases, or other types of things they might want to predict. And I don't think the ROI is there yet, because this is a medical application. They're still working through challenges with the healthcare system and health insurance in particular, regulatory approval. They have all these extra hurdles they have to get through. But I think the potential is there. And once again, that's something that just started with a bit of research for a PhD project. And others, I certainly was not the only one researching it at the time, but that topic has since exploded, and there's a lot of ROI to come from it to help doctors determine what type of cancer you have, how it should be treated, should you be in a clinical trial, different decisions like that, to provide a whole lot more information
Yeah,
than
two great
currently.
examples. I think one of the hidden superpowers of computer vision is that the rest of deep learning is great at processing numbers and structured data, and computer vision effectively converts images into data, well, into structured data or reduced data that then it can be processed with any other model that you have. So, for example, like what you were saying about being able to extract when the power plant is on or off, when you do that at scale, then it can extract very interesting patterns, and you effectively can use that information for a lot more applications. So that's one of my favoring examples as well, because it's not only about the particular ROI, it's about how much more data you now have available for working with after you have applied computer vision to the project. So what advice would you give companies thinking of whether it's worth building their own solution, or if they should purchase like a solution or use like an API or something like that? Like, what is your take with these approaches?
To me, it's pretty simple and perhaps overly simple. If there's an existing solution that solves your problem, use it. Anybody who comes to me to talk about what they're working on, if I know there's a tool that does that, I tell them to go try that. If it doesn't work out, then come back and talk to me. But explore the ones that are out there. It'll be way cheaper, far less headaches than trying to build your own. There is some nuance to it. It might be that the existing solutions don't fully solve your problem. It might be that the computer vision part of it is just a small part, and you have to build the full data pipeline and all the complex parts of the system anyway. And so, contracting out or purchasing that computer vision piece is just a small part, and so maybe you want to take that on yourself. It could be that domain expertise is very important here, and the systems that are out there require use manual annotation from somebody who's not a specialist in your type of imagery, or to build a fully functional system you need that domain expertise. Or it could be that you're looking to expand into this area in the future. So all of those could be reasons why you want to take this on yourself. If you do, be prepared. It'll be complex, it'll be expensive, it'll be time consuming, it'll be unpredictable. So if you can avoid that, go purchase the other solution or go use the open source toolkit. Start with that.
Yeah, in general, I completely agree. If there is a solution that works for you, use that. And even if it doesn't, I think it's going to give you a lot of information of what it's lacking and what it's working. So the same way that we were mentioning that building a simple solution first that already could act as a first solution, that it kind of says like what type of data do you need, or like what do you need to do to arrive to the point that you want to be, if this predefined solution doesn't actually get you there. And I feel in general, there's room for quite a lot of custom projects, that redoing something that is already done is not. I mean, you're always going to have a lot more cost by having to develop your own thing. So unless it's truly worth it in terms of cost and performance, then at least starting with the out of the box solution, it's always a good idea to me.
Right.
So we talk about the the parts and what it's necessary for a computer vision to work. What do you think are the most common pitfalls that most companies actually fall on when they try to bring their own projects to life? I mean, we already mentioned a few of them in the previous question, but what do you think are the most common ones that you see, are you think are the most prominent ones?
So there's two that come to mind, and the first one we've talked about a bit before, but that's data quality. So if your images are noisy, if they're full of artifacts, if there's a problem with your labeling, if the annotators had instructions but they interpreted it different ways, that's going to be a challenge in getting the model to learn these different perspectives. So anything related to data quality, image quality, label quality is kind of the first one. But there are some things you can do to prevent that. You can carefully plan how you're going to acquire these images, carefully check the quality of them. Maybe you need an additional automated step that does quality checking and discards images that don't meet your standards and can't be processed by the computer vision. You need a standard process for annotation. So you might take a first pass at this is what the annotators are going to do, but then you have a few of them go through it and you discover that they interpret it in different ways. So you need to go back and iterate on your annotation instructions and repeat that until you have a consistent set of annotations. So any kind of standardization there can help. And iterating quickly in order to get that information. So don't annotate your whole data sets. Don't collect all your images. Take a small sample, train your baseline model, see what you learn, and go back and try again if there's mistakes in it. So yeah, anything related to data quality is kind of number one. The other one I don't think we've talked about as much, and that's overfitting. And what I mean by that is a model that performs well on your training data, but fails on real world examples. So that could be because your training data is not diverse enough. It could be because there's a distribution shift. For example, you're at inference time, you've got images from a different imaging device, different scanner, different camera, different lab, something changed there, or they're from a different part of the world, or they're patients of a different race, different age, different sex, anything like that that changes, your model can very easily fail. And if you're naive going into it, those types of problems do come up. You need to understand the data. You need to work with domain experts in order to understand it. They're the ones who understand the distribution shifts far better than any of us technical people. As a machine learning engineer, we know it's a problem, but we don't know what those shifts are that we're trying to guard against. So domain experts are critical there. We need to plan for a diverse training set, plan for proper validation so that we can catch this before deploying the system. So that could be collecting data from a different facility, different part of the world. It just depends on the problem as to what that means. But the key is to be able to catch the problem before deployments. So those two of data quality and overfitting to me are the main two that come up.
Definitely. I feel like, yeah, data is number one for me as well. Yeah, overfitting, it can be very challenging, especially when you work with a small amount of data. The more data you have, in general, I would say that it's less of a problem. Then I would say like misaligned objectives, like when the internal metric that you have uh, as a as a data scientist, it's very different from the one that your customer actually cares about. That I've always feel that this is a big problem as well. Um, I mean, the other one would be edge cases. I feel it ties a little bit with overfitting because uh, yeah, is what we are talking. If there is none of those edge cases on your training set, then when you're trying it with real world data, then it might contain those edge cases that they have not been taken into account. So there's quite a few to take into account, but that's why it takes a little while to learn about computer vision and understand what are the important points in order to have a successful project. So what do you think that is going to be like the biggest change in computer vision? Is there anything else other than foundational models that you think is going to uh, be an important shift for computer vision?
Foundation models is still number one, but the other one I have in mind is the multimodal aspect. This is coming into more and more projects that I see. It's still very much going on the research area, but what I mean by multimodal is multiple modalities of imaging, or imaging plus genomics, or imaging plus language, or multiple satellite modalities plus ground data. There's different modalities you can bring into a single project that give a different perspective on the thing that you're trying to predict. And multimodal models very much come into foundation models as well. There are a number of multimodal foundation models, language and images being the main one that most of us are familiar with, models that can generate an image or that can take an image and tell you something about it or answer questions about it. But in the different domains that I work with satellite imagery and medical images, the different modalities that can become a part of it do give very important different perspectives that can give you a more powerful predictive model. So there's a lot of use cases that they can unlock, and I think foundation models is also the key to unlocking those applications.
No, definitely. I mean, what I think it's already like a massive reality, and it has been a big change, is pre-trained models. Just being able to train many models with a lot less data than before. I think it has been a massive change to reduce the amount of effort and monetary cost for computer vision projects. Then foundational models, clearly they seem to be the biggest next step that we're gonna get. And other than that, yeah, like probably like multimodal agents to see if we can have like some um, smaller computer vision model talk to a higher infrastructure. I think it could be quite interesting to keep the computer vision part very dedicated, focused, and segregated, and then just interact with the higher level intelligence with the LLM being the coordinator and stuff like that. That would be my pick. So now we talk about the future. What do you think are still the biggest misconceptions regarding computer vision that you might see? I don't know, like on LinkedIn, on your customers.
The biggest one that I can think of comes back to the data, and that's if you have data, you can make it work. Well, it neglects some of the critical aspects of data quality and quantity that we've already talked about, so I'm not going to go through all of that again. But just having data does not magically solve your problem. If you're trying to solve something, a supervised thing, you need annotation quality and consistency and quantity, of course. But understanding the data you have is critical to success, and I don't think everybody understands that going into it. But if you're working on a project, it becomes clear very quickly. And this may not be too surprising to domain experts who are not computer vision experts or AI experts whatsoever. They would probably tell you, yeah, you do need to know a lot about their data, and that is the key to making these things work. One of the most common things I hear from founders on my podcast is how critical it is to have AI and domain experts integrated into the same team. So they're not just meeting once a week, they're interacting on a daily basis. They're looking at the results together, they're planning the model approach together, they're helping define the annotation strategy. They're the different perspectives are involved in every day. And that has been critical to the success of many of the startups that I talk to. So this interdisciplinary collaboration definitely is key. And those who have not yet achieved some success may not know that going into it.
I feel like, yeah, clearly quality is better than model complexity. That would be like the biggest misconception. I also see like throwing a bigger and better model is not half as effective as throwing higher, more high quality data to the project. Um, but in general, I think like I agree with your take. So like the last question now, if you had a bit of advice for CTO, CEO, someone in the C-suite, considering their first computer vision project, what would it be? What piece of advice do you have for them uh, regarding computer vision?
So, my advice is actually not directly about computer vision. It's about understanding the use case. It's about evaluating possible solutions. Is computer vision actually the best approach? It's definitely not the right tool for every problem. So, thinking through that very carefully, it's really key to understand how a potential solution will fit in with the existing workflow. And medical examples, kind of the best one I can give here, will the computer vision AI you're developing will prioritize what the practitioner will look at, or will it check their work for errors? So, kind of which order do they operate in? Or maybe it'll provide some insights to help the practitioner make better decisions. All of these workflows are possible, but what is actually more helpful for the thing that the practitioner is doing and for the outcome of the patients? So, the practitioner might need to trust the AI. Are there steps you can do to build trust? Do you need explainability to be part of it? That's something you would need to understand up front. The last thing you want is for the AI solution to get in the way and interrupt the workflow of the practitioner, and it might not even get used in the end. So, all that workflow stuff that comes before the computer vision, if computer vision is in fact the right solution, at least knowing where that will fit in the workflow so that it doesn't impede anybody. And then one other small tip to add to that is just start with a narrow use case. Don't try to solve the full problem. Bite off a small piece and try to solve that first.
I really liked the first one. Clearly, if and I feel like this is something that it's kind of the work of the consultant sometimes, making sure that the client doesn't shoot on his own feet, because I mean it's not their fault, and I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying like when you have your own company and you see a problem and you want to fix it, sometimes you get a bit too excited. I know that it happens for myself, but as a consultant, I feel like you need to detach yourself from the excitement of the client and making sure that you give like an objective advice, and making sure to say like, is this problem going to benefit from computer vision or any solution that it is? And when you select one solution, start simple and then you can scale it into something smarter, especially making sure that you have good data and that you can get it in a way that is not going to cost you an incredible amount of time or money. And I would say like that those are the biggest examples that I can come up with. But no, in general, I agree with you. I think like what you've said is a very sound advice. So I think those were all the questions we had for you, Heather. Thank you very much for joining us in this episode. Um, wish you great luck with all your endeavors, and hope to keep in touch and hear from you soon again.
Thank you, EU. It was great being here today and chatting with you. I appreciate it. So, thank you so much.
Perfect.